Eternal life is a free gift from God. Jesus died for you at Calvary. He is the way, the truth, the life, the door. If you believe in Him, you shall be saved, 'cause God's free gift to you is eternal life through Jesus Christ the Lord.
We are going to continue our study in the Kings of the Old Testament. This is lesson 2. Last week we looked at the life of King Saul, and this week we are going to take a look at King David. Now, King David is held up as an example of a man that loves the Lord, an example for us to follow. We find statements throughout the Old Testament. It says, as my father David did walk, or he walked not in my ways as David walks. We find that reference throughout all the other kings. And he is an example. In fact, Jesus referred to King David many times when he was teaching. The New Testament as a whole refers to this king more than any other king. He's mentioned in Revelation, he's mentioned in the 4 Gospels, he's mentioned in Paul's writings, he's mentioned in the book of Hebrews. He is an example. Now, David was a shepherd, he was a king, and he was a psalmist. He wrote many great psalms. And yet, this great man, no one thought highly of David in his early days. When Samuel told David to present his sons, he didn't bother with David. And even when David was going to fight Goliath, Saul didn't think he could fight Goliath. His brothers didn't think he was fit to fight. And yet, if we're going to be successful in life, we're going to have to cast aside man's opinion of us and realise that we can do all things through Christ that strengthens us. If God be for us, who can be against us? You may not feel that you are fit to do the job, but if God has called you to do the job, He will give you the ability to do the job. He was a man after God's heart. That doesn't mean he was perfect. We find, as we do our studies, that he did things wrong before he became king, and he did things wrong after he became king. Let's take a look at the background and the calling of David. David was a descendant of Boaz and Ruth. We find that in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, and I read verse 17. I'll read in verse 16. And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse to it. And the woman, her neighbour, gave it a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi. And they called her name Obed. And he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. David was chosen to replace Saul after he had been rejected by the Lord. This king, King Saul, was given a great chance, as we saw last week, but he refused to obey God. His first sin was to offer a sacrifice that he knew he had no right to do it, because he had been raised up in the ways of the Jewish law, and he knew that only the priest from the tribe of Levi had the right to offer a sacrifice. And yet he offered it himself. He found an excuse to do it, but he was wrong. And then again, God spoke to Saul for the prophet Samuel and told him to utterly destroy the Amalekites. But he didn't totally destroy. He saved the best, and he saved the king. And Samuel said, you haven't obeyed God. I'm using my own words here. Now therefore God has chosen one to replace him. Yet Samuel continues to grieve over Saul. 1 Samuel 16. Let me just take a look at a few verses from 1 Samuel chapter 16. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine own with oil, and I will send thee to Jesse, to Bethlehem, and I will provide me a king among his sons. There comes a time when we realise that God has rejected somebody, we have to move on. In fact, Jesus even taught that same principle. He said, if you go into a place and they reject you, wipe the dust off your feet and move on. There comes a time. Samuel knew that God had rejected Saul, yet he continued to weep, and God rebuked him. So he was sent to the son of Jesse, but he was not told which one of his sons it would be. Oftentimes God sends us somewhere, but he doesn't tell us the whole thing. He reveals it bit by bit. So let's take a look at when Samuel meets Jesse and his sons. Now we see a difference between what Samuel sees when he meets the sons and what God sees. Let me read 1 Samuel 16, 6 and 7. And it came to pass that when they were come, he looked on Eliab and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeketh not, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. We have a saying, all that glitters is not gold. Just because somebody may look right doesn't mean they are right. There are many people that have gone into wrong marriages because they look at the man and think, oh, how handsome, oh, how tall, oh, he looks so wonderful, he looks ideal husband material. Or the husband looks on the woman and says, oh, she's attractive, oh, she's nice. But you know, only God knows what is in the heart of a person. Only God knows. Man looks on the outside, but God knows what that person is really like. And that is why we must always seek God. We must walk by faith and not by sight. We must seek God and not go because something looks good doesn't mean it is good, because as we just said, all that glitters is not gold. Now David was not even considered good enough by his father to present him to Samuel. He left David minding the sheep. And yet that was the man that God wanted. Sometimes God uses people that most people wouldn't think of using. I mean, you take a look at the disciples that Jesus chose. He didn't go for the intellectuals, the well-to-do. He took ordinary people like fishermen, tax collectors. And God uses ordinary people. He takes the things that are not to bring to naught the things that are, so that no flesh is glorified in his sight. He uses ordinary people. There's not many wise, not many of the intellectuals are called. There are a few, but God takes the ordinary people. They may not have a great education, but God is not interested in what's the abilities of a man, because God is not interested in what we can do for him, but on what he can do through us in the power of the Holy Spirit. Samuel would have taken the first son because he looked good, but God wanted the person that no one else wanted. David is summoned to appear. Let me read 1 Samuel 16, 11 and 12. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Hear all thy children. And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest. And behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch, for we will not sit down till he come hither. Let me tell you, friends, I don't care what situation you may have been in. You may have not been your parents' favourite son. You may have not been the teacher's pet. You may have been rejected. But there is a God in heaven that is waiting to call you. There's a God in heaven that is waiting to use you. And there's going to come a day when God's going to say, Fetch him. And in verse 12, and he sent and brought him. And he was ruddy and godly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for he is thee. That's the one I want, him. Not the one you want, is Samuel, the one I want. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if every pastor, every deacon, every evangelist was chosen by God, and not man thinking, oh, well, he looks good. I mean, he's got a PhD, he's got a doctor's degree, he looks good, he's got a big job. Wouldn't it be wonderful if people was to seek God for God's choice? And then the future king is anointed. Let's take a look where David meets Saul. David is introduced to Saul as a musician to drive away the evil spirits. 1 Samuel 16, 14 to 23. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and the evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And behold, and Saul's servants said unto him, Behold, now an evil spirit from God troubleth him. And the Lord now commandeth thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is cunning player on an harp. And it shall come to pass that when evil spirits from God's upon thee, he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. Or we can learn a lot about having the right kind of music in our church. Godly music in our church. Because godly music can bring deliverance. Godly music can set people free. And when David began to play the harp, the spirit left him. But as we can see, Saul never repented, and there came a time later on where David's playing achieved nothing. Because we find out later on that another time when David played the harp, instead of the evil spirit leaving, Saul got hold of a javelin and threw it at him to kill him. At first Saul loved David, even making him his armour bearer. But we're going to see that love was short-lived, because Saul saw David as a harp player. He saw him strong enough to be an armour bearer. He was a brave man, because armour bearers had to be brave. They carried the extra weapons that the king was going to use. And when the battle was raging, the armour bearer had to stand there. You couldn't have a coward armour bearer. You couldn't have one that ran away. So Saul recognised David as a faithful person. He recognised him as a brave person. And he recognised him as an anointed musician. But later on we find out that he also recognised that God was with him, and he became fearful. Not with him in the sense of playing the harp, but with him in the sense that Saul realised that David was going to replace him, and he sought to kill him. But at first Saul loved him, but it wasn't going to last. The anointed causes the evil spirit to leave. We read that in chapter 16, verse 23. And it came to pass that the evil spirit of God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hands. So Saul was refreshed, and he was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Now, we take one of the well-known stories of the Bible, David and Goliath. This Philistine giant intimidates Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 1 to 10. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were to gather together at Shochoh, and that belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephesdammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched in the valley of Elah, and set battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass upon his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. And if I prevail against him and kill him, then ye shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel. This day give me a man, that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Everybody was scared to fight him. The king was scared. David's brother was scared. Even the one that Samuel said, surely, he was scared. David was not there when Goliath shouted out. He was up back minding the sheep. Anointed to be king, but he never let it get to his head. He went back to mind the sheep. There are times when God calls us to do something. He may have called you to be a pastor. That doesn't mean he's going to make you a pastor today. He can call you and prepare you, and in time, God will bring it to pass. David's father sends him with some food for his brothers. So let's take a look at preparing for battle. David hears the boast and is angered by it. Let me read 1 Samuel 17, 22 to 23. And as he talked, that's David, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion of the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words, and David heard them. Here we've got a man of God that's hearing them. Something is going to happen. When a man of God hears something that shouldn't be, he'll always take action. Go on to verse 26. And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to this man that killeth the Philistines, and take away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the arms of the living God. The king was scared. The soldiers were scared. David's brothers that were soldiers there, they were all scared. But here's David. He's getting ready to fight now. What's going to happen? Who is this person? I can just see David saying, let me get him, let me get him, let me get him. I'll get him. David tells Saul he will fight. Can you just get that picture? None of his brothers, none of his fame, none of his soldiers, not even Saul himself, but David said, I'm going to fight him. I'll fight him. But Saul does not think he is ready. 1 Samuel 17 verse 33. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. For thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. I want to tell you, friends, if you're a man of God, you ain't scared of nothing, because God didn't give us the spirit of fear to fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. And David knew that greater was he that was in him than he that was in the world. David tells Saul that he had fought animals more dangerous than this giant. Verse 37. And David said, moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hands of the Philistines. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Let me tell you, any person, anyone that can fight one of these is certainly not going to be scared of one of them. Because what would you rather fight? Think about it. If you had a choice between fighting each one of these, who would you choose? I know what I would choose. I would choose Goliath. Because I'll probably stand more chance with Goliath than I would do with the lion and the bear. And anyone that can fight a lion or a bear ain't going to be scared of Goliath. Let's take a look at the day of the battle now. David rejects Saul's armour and he picks up 5 stones. Even though Saul was too scared to fight Goliath, he didn't mind telling David how to fight him. Oh, you've got to put on this armour. It always amazes me that people that don't do anything always want to tell you how it should be done. And David rejects the armour, but he uses the weapons that he knew how to fight. He picks up 5 stones. And then Goliath ridicules him. 1 Samuel 17 verses 42. And when the Philistines looked about and saw David, he disdained him, and he was but a youth and ruddy, and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. And the Philistines said, David, come to me, and I will give the flesh to the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Yet David declares that God will give him the victory. 45 to 47. And then said David to the Philistine, now comest to me with a sword and a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, which thou defiest. This day will the Lord deliver thee in my hands, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give it to the carcasses and the host of the Philistines this day, unto the fowls of the air, and the wild beast of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Goliath said, I will do it. But David never said, I will do it. David said, God will do it. God will deliver. Oh, the battle is not ours, but it is the Lord's. David slew Goliath. Just put one stone and put it in a sling and it hit his head. Right on target. And then David, he takes Goliath's sword and he cuts off his head. And then David holds up Goliath's head so that all can see that he is dead. And by the time he held up his head, all Israel, the army, came and fought the Philistines. And there was a great victory that day. Let's take a look at David and Jonathan. The story of David and Jonathan has been twisted by those that want to promote homosexual lifestyle. Because today people cannot understand that there can be a perfect love, a holy love between two people of the same gender that is not sexual. David did love Jonathan, but it was not a homosexual kind of love. It was a godly kind of love, a brotherly kind of love. David's use of words to show his love for Jonathan was never understood to be homosexual, either by the Jews or by the church. The Jews at that time would never have accepted a homosexual as a king. It was never understood that way. David was a married man who saw only sexual fulfillment in women. He was married to several women. In fact, his very sin with Bathsheba, he walked outside and he saw a woman and he lusted after that woman. Does that sound like something a homosexual would do? Does that sound like something a gay man would do? We find that David married to more than one woman. I'm not saying that's right, but he married to more than one woman. He was a heterosexual man. And in fact, it was his uncontrol of his heterosexual relationships that led him into sin with Bathsheba. He was a man after God's heart. A homosexual would never be called that. In fact, for David to be a homosexual would go against Old Testament scriptures, like Leviticus 18 verse 22 and 20:13 and Romans 1 18 to 25. David's old lifestyle shows that he was a heterosexual. There was no homosexual love between David and Jonathan. When David expressed his love, he was expressing a godly kind of love. But he said his love for him exceeded that of a woman. He was showing out, he was using words to show how much he loved him, but not in a way that a man would love a woman. Not in a homosexual way. There was no sexual desire, either by David or by Jonathan. They were both heterosexual. But in these days, the homosexual community have got their agenda. They want to rewrite history to make everybody seem like an homosexual. And they want to rewrite the Bible to make people like David and Jonathan homosexual, and Ruth and Naomi. They tried to make them look like a gay relationship. It was not. And there is nothing in the ancient commentaries by the Jews that suggests that it was ever even thought of that they were homosexual. Now David's life is at risk. Saul becomes jealous of David and he tried to kill him. Let's take a look at 1 Samuel 18 and from 6 to 11 we see the jealousy. I'll read from verse 5. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass that as they came, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets and joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another, and they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul gets jealous here. We read in verse 8. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and unto me they have ascribed but thousands. What can he have more than the kingdom? And it was at this moment that he realized that the man that Samuel had told him that God will take it away and give him after a man after his own heart. It was then that he realized that David was that man. And from that day he sought to kill him. He even pretended to like David in order to send him to his death. Not everybody that says they like you likes you. First Samuel 18, I read from verse 17. And Saul said to David, Behold my daughter Merab, her will I give to thee to wife. Be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. And Saul said, Let not mine hand be upon thee, but that the hands of the Philistines be upon thee. He pretended to be his friend. He pretended he wanted to give his daughter to David as wife. But he was really sending him out to battle in order that the Philistines might kill him. And David said unto, Who am I? And what is my life of my father's family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to a king? See the humility of David here? But it came to pass that Merab's daughter, and it came to pass at the time when Merab's daughter should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel, Methuselah, to wife. After accepting David back again, he tries to kill him. And he sends people to his house to kill him. So 1 Samuel 19, verses 9 to 17. We read that Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away. And this was the time when David was playing the harp. Verse 8 we read that he was spirit from the Lord came upon Saul and sat in the house, and the javelin in his hand, and David played with it with his hand, and Saul sought to smite. You know, friends, sometimes a person we're playing with sin, they come into church, they feel good, they feel better, but if they don't repent and don't change their life, they will find that none of the preaching, none of the godly music has any effect on them anymore. Saul had got so bad, he had become so evil, that David's music that once drove the spirit away only now made Saul more angry. And in verse 10, and Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence. and he smote the javelin into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. And Saul sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal's, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down from the window, and he went and fled and escaped. And then Michal took an ornament, put it in the bed, and pretended when the soldiers came, and then they went back to Saul, and then Saul commanded, bring him in the bed so I can get him. Bring him in the bed and I'll slay him. But when they came and pulled back the bed, they found out that they had been tricked. David goes to Naioth and is divinely protected. In 1 Samuel 19 and verse 24, very interesting account, how that God divinely protects David. David flees. Saul finds out. He sends some soldiers to him, and as they get near, before they do anything, the Spirit of God comes upon them, and they start to prophesy. And then Saul sends more people. They get near. They come to kill David, and as soon as they get near, all of a sudden, the Spirit of God comes upon them, and they start to prophesy. And then Saul comes, a man that's got a demon spirit. He comes to seek, but the Spirit of God comes upon him. And because he's already troubled with an evil spirit, he does some unusual things. The man's got an evil spirit, but he comes into a place where the Spirit of God is moving. And he takes off his clothes and lays down and prophesies naked. God was protecting David. And then over and over again, Saul continues to seek and to kill David. For we read in 1 Samuel 23 and 14. And David abode in the wilderness, the strongholds, and remained in the mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hands. If God be for us, who can be against us, eh? And yet David is given a chance to kill Saul, and yet he refuses to kill Saul. David has two opportunities to kill Saul, and we read about them in 1 Samuel 24, 1 to 22, and 1 Samuel 26, 1 to 24. And yet on both occasions, David doesn't. He goes in, he gets a chance to kill him, but all he does is cut a little bit off his garment, because he realised something. That he cannot touch the Lord's anointed. David still recognised that Saul was the Lord's anointed. Even though Saul was troubled by an evil spirit, even though Saul was out to kill David, he still recognised him as being the Lord's anointed. There's a lesson that we can learn from there. Oh, I see things that are wrong in churches. And there are sometimes members take it upon themselves to split the church, to take members away. David didn't do that. David didn't cause a rebellion. He just left it in God's hand. Let me tell you, friends, don't ever get tempted to take away God's anointed. Leave them in God's hand. He will remove them when he wants them removed, and he will replace them when he wants them replaced. For David knew that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. David recognised Saul was still God's anointed, like we just said. We read that in 1 Samuel 14, 6, 26, 22 to 23. David was prepared to leave the situation in God's hands. And so must we. So must we. Now I want to take a look at David's temporarily decline. When David was in a backslidden state, we read that David lies to protect his own life. Let us turn to 1 Samuel chapter 21. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? And David said unto Ahimelech, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know what thing the business whereabouts I will send thee, which I have commanded thee. Saul never gave many command. He was on the run from Saul. He was lying to the priest. We can see how David was backsliding here. Fear had got a hold of David, and he was lying to the priest. David lies to protect his own life while others pay with theirs. David lied about the bread, and that lie, all lies have consequences. And the result of that was David lied to protect his life, but he put other people's life at risk. For we read that there was a man called Doeg that was there. And a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, and the chief of the herdsmen, and belonged to Saul. And then if we go over to chapter 22 and verse 9, Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse come in to Nob, to Abimelech, the son of Hattab. He reported it to Saul. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and he gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath to the Philistines. And the king sent to Abimelech, the priest, the son of Erah, his father's house, and the priests that were in Nob, and they came, all of them, to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Hattab. And he answered and said, Here I am, my lord. And the Saul said unto him, Why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou gavest him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait at the day? Then Abimelech answered the king and said, Whoso is faithful in all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at the biddings, and is honourable in thine house. Did I then begin to inquire of the Lord for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto thy servants, nor to all thy house of my fathers, for thy servants knew nothing of all this. And the king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and thy father's house. See, David's lie cost the life of the priest. And the king stood at the footmen and stood about him, Turn and slay the priest of the Lord, because the hands also is with David, and because they knew when he fled, and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hands to fall upon the priest of the Lord. See how backslidden Saul got? And the king said to Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priest. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priest, and slew them all that day. 85 persons, 85 that is, that did wear the linen. They killed that day, all because David had told a lie. The consequences of that lie, David lied to protect his own life, but he put the life of others at risk. This was a low area of David's life. And then David, he acts like he's crazy. He acts like a madman. 1 Samuel chapter 21, and reading from verse 10. And David rose and fled that day in fear, and he went to Achish, the king of Gath. That is, where did Goliath come from? Gath. He had run to the enemies. In order to get away from Saul, he ran to the enemy. The servants of Achor said unto him, Is not this David the king of the land? Wait a minute. Notice those words. Is not this David the king of the land? But David was not yet king. Saul was king. But the Philistines, they recognised that David was going to be king. Amazing how sometimes the unsaved people can recognise things that even Christians don't recognise. They called him the king of the land. And yet he had not been made king yet. Saul was still king. So he said, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing unto another of the hymn dances, saying, Saul have slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? And David laid up all these words, and he was sore afraid, he was scared of Achish, king of Gath. And he changed his behaviour before them. And he framed himself mad in their hands, and scribbled on the doors of the gate. And he let the spittle fall down upon his beard. He acted like a crazy, mad man. This was the lowest part of David's life. And then David loses all hope and backslides. We read that in 1 Samuel chapter 27 and verse 1. 1 Samuel 27 and verse 1. And David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hands of the Saul. There is nothing better for me that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me and seek me any more in any coast of Israel, so I escape out of his hand. And David rose, and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Mahoch, king of Gath. And David dwelt in Achish of Gath, he and his men, every day with his household. He loses all hope. Look what he says. And David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day. Yet God had said he's going to be king. And yet David had got to that place where he knew, where he believed that Saul would one day eventually kill him. He had lost all hope. And he went and joined himself to the Philistines. And David was prepared to fight with the enemy against these people. There came a time when David was in such a backslidden state, he was willing to join with the Philistines and fight Israel. 1 Samuel 28 verses 1 and 2. And it came to pass that in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And Achish said unto David, Know thou assuredly that thou shalt go with me to battle, and thy men. And look what David said. And David said unto Achish, Surely thou shalt know what my servant can do. And Achish said to David, Therefore I will make thee the keeper of my head forever. He was willing to send his men to fight against Israel. That's how backslidden he had become. Chapter 29. And the Philistines gathered together all the armies to Aphalek, and the Israelites pitched by the fountains which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed on the hundreds by thousands, but David and his men passed on the rearward with Achish. They were all prepared. David had joined with the enemy and was going to fight against God's people. But God was still had a plan for David, and he was about to deliver him from that mistake. Then the princess, verse 3, of chapter 29. Then the princes of the Philistines said, what do these Hebrews here? And Archie said unto the princes of the Philistines, is not this David, the son of Saul, the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days and these years, and I have found no fault in him, since he fell unto me this day? And the prince of the Philistines were wroth with him. And the prince of the Philistines said unto him, make this fellow return, that he may go again to his place, that thou appointest him, and let not him go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith shall he reconcile himself unto his master? Should it not be with their heads of these men? Is not this David, to whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Verse 6, and Archie called David and said, surely, as the Lord liveth, thou hast been upright, and thy going out and thy coming in with me in the host is good in my sight. I have not found evil in thee since the day of thy coming unto me. For this day, nevertheless, the Lord favour thee not. Wherefore now return and go in peace, and thou displease not the lords of the Philistines. And yet David still wanted to fight. He was still prepared to go out and fight Israel. For in verse 8, and David said unto Hedges, what have I done? And what hast thou found in thy servant so long that I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go out, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my Lord? Referring to the Archers. And Archers answered and said unto David, I know that thou art good in my sight, as an angel of God. Notwithstanding, the prince of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to battle. Wherefore now arise up early in the morning with thy men, master servants, that are come with thee, and soon be up early in the morning, and have light depart. So David with his men rose up early to depart in the morning, to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. And of course that would be the battle, the final battle in which Saul was killed. And God kept David out of that battle, even though David had been in a backslidden state, even though David was willing to use his 600 men to fight with the Philistines against the people that he would be king of, that God had called him to be king of. And even when God used the Philistines to stop them from using David, David still wanted to go out and fight, and David reluctantly did not go to war. What do we learn? David made many mistakes. David was a human being. He'd done things that were wrong, but God was still able to use him, and he was still able to make him a great king. And maybe you that are watching this video, maybe you've done many things wrong in your life, or you're a Christian, but you've done things you shouldn't have done. You've made decisions that you shouldn't have made. And like David, you may have rebelled against God. But God can still use you. He can still raise you up, if you're prepared to call upon him. And next week we're going to take a look at what happened when David became king. We come to the end of this subject, and may God's presence remain and abide with you.
From Jesus Christ, 'cause he didn't have eternal life. Jesus said you've got to be born again. For that which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which